Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small-town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight, we are going to go back to the land of the occult and crochet. I had a really busy day today and did not get the yarn set out that I was going to use, so we'll have to skip the crochet part tonight. I was running late as it was. So, let me just make sure everything is up and running. It looks like it should be. We'll see here in a minute. But how's everybody's week been? It's been an interesting week with new work and new jobs and all that fun stuff. This for me anyway. And I'm not sure what Odyssey's doing. It seems to be a little bit slow. Oh, there it is. Okay. No, we don't need to hear it. Anyway, sorry, I'm I feel like a newbie right now because I've been doing all this new stuff at this new job I'm doing during the day, and that's why I'm a little bit flustered tonight. Anyway, back to the topic of discussion. Tonight, I would like to introduce you to a gentleman that I had heard something about and I'd read a little bit about, but bringing him up for this topic was an eye-opener on a couple of things. So, we're going to hop into the story and the history of Franz Anton Mesmer. One of the references I heard him was the French wizard, which is kind of entertaining to me, but so Franz Anton Mesmer was actually born in southern Germany, which I'm not sure why they call him French, but you know, in May of 1734, to parents Forrester Anton Mesmer and Maria Ursula. His parents were religious and simple people, it was said. He was born the third in a family of 9 kids, but back in when he was born in this 18th century, having huge families was kind of a common thing. Winters must have been a little cold there. The other part about that is you might have had 9 kids. How many of them made them to adulthood? Life was a lot harder back then. But Franz seemed to have been a loner even from the beginning, preferring the quietude of nature and introspection, it is said, from a very young age. It was implied he developed a magnetic presence during those years. People were just drawn to him, and he could pretty much get his way, even as from a young age, with anything he really wanted. Franz studied theology, interestingly enough, at the Jesuit University of Dillingen, and then he also studied law at, I wrote down, we'll try this, Ingolstadt, close, I guess, in Munich, Germany. But from there, he took up the study of medicine and the University of Vienna. So he liked to learn, is one of the big things that popped out to me as I was researching him. Is it didn't matter what it was. I mean, between theology, law, and medicine, that's some fairly intensive research projects he had going on there. In 1768, he married Anna Maria von Posch, interesting name, and it was said that she was a wealthy widow, and from that time he established himself as a full doctor in Vienna. And now, as a wealthy man, he could be a patron for the arts. Of course he would. He helped out the young composer Mozart during the very beginning of his career. I believe Mozart was like 14 or 15 when Mesmer actually worked with him. So, there's this little bit about this random German guy. He is an interesting character, and he does actually fit into the bigger picture of mysticism, as we would call it today. Let's see, I have a picture too. I think. Here we go. This is Franz A. Mesmer, a German physician that had a side interest in astrology, but his side interest leaked very, very strongly into his medical practice. And we'll make him go away. There we go. Franz wrote a dissertation at the University of Vienna that he used information that there has been some discussion about whether it was fully plagiarized from a British physician, Richard Mead, or wasn't plagiarized, but there's enough similarities there that even today they question whether or not it was almost copied word for word at points. But his dissertation was suggesting that the gravitational pull of the planets affected the invisible fluids within the human body. It's interesting that he would use the term fluid. We would call it an energy field, but he used the example of the moon's pull on the tides of Earth. That makes sense. And in my personal opinion, side note from the whole story, I believe that the moon does actually affect we as little humans running around here. Our body is between 70 and 80% water. So there's a reason that the term lunacy tends to be a good term for people during the nights of the full moon. And if you know any law enforcement or EMTs or medical people in ERs especially, ask them what a full moon means, and they will tell you that the moon does affect people in a very unique way. But anyway, we'll go back to Franz here. In 1775, he adjusted his theory from gravitation to magnetism. Interesting switch. So the invisible fluid acted like a magnet, not being pulled around by a gravitational force. Franz used the term animal magnetism to describe this action. He actually used the term animal magnetism in a controversial attack against an exorcist at the time, of all the odd people to be fighting with. Franz claimed that the priest didn't cast out demons, but used the priest's natural animal magnetism to realign that fluid within the patient's body. This controversy was the start of the split between psychiatry and religion in a lot of different sources. He was actually practicing his version of psychiatry even before the likes of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, so this is, quite the time period beforehand. Franz believed this magnetic property could be manipulated by a magnetized object in the hands of a trained professional. At least he kept his, medical training intact. Illness was a result of the blocks in flow of this invisible fluid, what we would probably call today an energy like chi or prana. Franz believed in a state of trance or mesmerism, what we would call today hypnotism, that these blocks could be overcome and restore the harmonic flow of the fluid. In 1778, he was accused of fraud, of course, by Viennese physicians, multiples of them. So he packed up and said toodaloo and bounced over to France. Landing in Paris, he continued his practice and his research. And side note, some modern-day theorists believe that he figured out that the meridian system of the body, and that his healing theories are closer to the practices of medical qigong practitioners today. Interesting, since there's no real reference or proof that he ever had any connection to any of these secret Asian practices, qigong actually didn't make it into outside of the area where it was developed until the last 100 years or so. So for him to have learned it, he would have had to have went there, but I couldn't find in any reference digging around that he'd ever had any experience with any of the Asian healing arts. Just side note. Franz's practice started by building a trust or a rapport with the client, which is a good way to start your sessions. Then he would poke and prod various points of the body while speaking quietly until a small healing crisis would occur. And here is an example of that type. Make that a little bit bigger. There you go. Of kind of like poking around at a person, and usually it would start on their shoulders or their hands, and he would tap up their arms towards their shoulders, their neck. Sometimes it would be on their face. And what would happen is a person would actually start to respond, and it would trigger an emotional response, which would be a small healing crisis, where the person would start to convulse. Sometimes they'd shake. Several of the articles that I was looking through said that people would burst into spontaneous fits of laughter or tears, but it was basically their emotions, the healing crisis of their emotions was coming forward, and it was triggering this response. Alternatively, he would sit facing the client and have their knees between his knees, and he would rub his hands from the client's shoulders to their hands, so in a sweeping motion down. Followed by waving his hands, according to some of the documents, mysteriously in front of their bodies, after which the client would describe various flows of either inside or outside on like the surface of their body, different energy or flows. It felt like fluid was moving. After which the client, this is how he came to believe that there was a fluid within the body. We now know more closely what that would be with our modern day broader range of mystic knowledge. Excuse me. At the start of this practice, he would use a magnetized tools, but after a short while, he discovered that the magnet wasn't actually working. It wasn't the key to it. It helped, but it wasn't what was doing it. It was the animal magnetism, is what he would call it. Today we would call it bioenergy, chi, prana, the ether, etc. But it was the practitioner's energy that was doing the work. This magnetism and the rapport built with the client allowed the practitioner to work with what we would call the subconscious mind and adjust the conscious world's reality, which gets a little intensive when you start thinking like that. Just checking something real quick. Okay. It's pretty fascinating with what we know today, looking back at some of his ideas, because he was talking about stuff that is basically energy work 101. But back in that time, this was groundbreaking. People didn't even, especially in the Western worlds, had no knowledge of this type of work. The ether that I referenced came from a Greek practice, but that had been lost at this point. The chi and prana, those were Eastern, and there wasn't, from my research, there wasn't a lot of crossover there. And the chi training especially was held within very exclusive groups within China at that time. So your qigong and tai chi and a lot of your martial arts, that was a hidden secret knowledge that wasn't public. So what he was discovering basically accidentally was very similar to what Usai was discovering with Reiki almost 200 years later. So it's interesting how this knowledge trickles its way forward. Excuse me for 1 second. Franz had discovered that water, interestingly enough, and glass could hold and transmit magnetism. So glass, especially during this time, was made of silicon, which was developed from basically melting sand, certain kinds of sand. So you're getting a form of quartz crystal glass. The glass of those time periods was very unique in that in its design and development. And so what he was actually, in my mind, what he was doing was he was actually charging a reformed crystal and the water chemistry. So he was shifting the water and structuring it, but he was also charging these shards of glass, which was structured crystal, and using that as his magnetic battery, which was pretty awesome. He started creating big tubs filled with glass and water, and he would magnetize the whole thing set up all together. And I couldn't find a good picture of this. The wood sketches were really questionable at best, so I couldn't find any good ones for this one. But once the glass and the water were fully charged to his standards, they would place a lid on top of the tub that had rods with hoses attached to it. So patients could sit around the tubs, up to 20 patients depending on the size of the tub. There were some of the images that were, like I said, they weren't really well drawn, would show like 6 of these huge tubs in a hall, like a great hall. And you'd have the room full of people, and they would all be sitting around. You could see different places they would put the rods on their body. And you would take the rod that's attached to the tub full of water and glass, and you would place it upon the ailing part of your body using that pre-charged energy, basically a giant chi battery, to heal that aspect of the body. Eventually, he started to magnetize trees as well, so even the poor could use the healing, because the big tubs and these halls with all the fancy stuff that he was developing, that was pretty much held exclusively for the wealthy. The everyday average Joe couldn't go in there and use any of that. So he would go out to trees, because they can carry a minor charge, and he would charge trees around the towns he was in, so that people would know this is a healing tree. You can go there, and as long as the tree was alive, it would continue to regenerate that charge. So that was pretty cool of him. Over the years, Franz was very successful, although a little flamboyant and theatrical, and once again, because of his theatrics, he attracted unwanted attention of the mainstream medical establishment, which is why a lot of people in today's alternative health practices, if you'll notice, you have a few that are really flamboyant and out there, but the rest of them are pretty, like low-key, they're everyday people, because there's a history of the mainstream medical community going after people who do alternative medicine. And it's going on for, 300 years, according to what we found here. King Louis XVI, though, decided to test Franz's practices. In 1784, the king appointed a commission to investigate. And this commission, let's just say government commissions don't work out well together. Anyhow, included in the list of researchers evaluating the claims were the American inventor, statesman, and ambassador Benjamin Franklin. There was also a French chemist by the name of Anton Laurent Lavoisier. The outcome of this commission wasn't great, but that's not a surprise to anybody who has paid attention to much of this. But the reason was they went after this invisible fluid he claimed to exist. They didn't even acknowledge at first what he was doing. Whether it worked or not wasn't the point. They were wanting to find out what this fluid was. Like I said, it was an energy. We would now call it energy. The commission decided nothing Franz practice could be scientifically proven at that time. But they also still believed in bloodletting, so let's talk about proof. They claimed that his practice was imaginary and offered no real cure for anything. One of the commission did actually think he might be onto something worth researching in practice, but he was the only one that looked at his entire practice, like the entire thing, the energy work, the running the hands down the arms, focusing on the healing of that body part. But there was only one who paid attention to that. But for all intents and purposes, the rest of the group ignored this person. Their overall denouncement led Franz's practice to fall off, and eventually he exiled himself, and he wandered around Europe, eventually stopping in Switzerland for a decent amount of time. While in Switzerland, he practiced for a number of years before retiring back to his home country of Germany, where he eventually passed away in 1815. He wanted a simple burial, but the people in the village regarded him highly because he was doing healing work and was benefiting them. The people decided to have him buried in a Catholic ceremony, and a small monument was erected over his grave. There's two different pictures we'll show here. This is the first one. What's interesting to me was that he was interred in a Catholic cemetery, but his gravestone and monument shows nothing religious. And it's a three-sided short obelisk sitting on top of three steps. We'll bounce back to the other picture there. See? 1, 2, 3. Each side of the obelisk has a different picture. None of them are Christian. One is a pyramid with the eye above it, so a lot like what you'd see on the American dollar bill. Another one is a drawing of the planets moving around the sun. That was another one of his philosophies. And the last one was a simple torch, lighting the way for the future. On top of the obelisk, as I just showed, is a compass, a tool that is based on the principles of magnetism. But the story of his practice doesn't actually end there. Other researchers over time picked up his study because it worked, and they couldn't figure out how, so they experimented. And in time, the use of what we would call today hypnosis or hypnotherapy became a legitimate practice for use in psychotherapy and in a multitude of different health-related situations. It's still frowned upon by certain parts of the mainstream medical community, but the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, and they can't deny that it works. They don't like to admit it because they can't figure out how. Oddly enough, what Franz discovered was actually a historical practice under other names dating back centuries in different cultures, as I said, in China. Egypt had this as practice similar to this. Rome had one, as well as Greece. The practice of using trance states leading to altered states of reality to find cures or fix energy balances within the body was held within all of these mystic practices. So it was a secret that was clouded in mystery, but wasn't unknown to the people in the know. But they didn't talk about it. Dr. Franz Mesmer brought this practice out of the shadows and into the light of day, trying to show that there were more than one way that you could heal a person. Only to have, as has happened before, and I think I already did one story like this, the mainstream medical leaders shove it back in the shadows, saying that he was a fraud and a charlatan. In my research, I did run across a suggestion that Franz's work may have influenced one of modern-day psychology's greatest teachers, and that would be Sigmund Freud. An interesting connection, if that's true. But Sigmund Freud also inspired Carl Jung, so there's, the modern-day parents, basically, of modern-day psychology have a lot of interesting research that's very similar to what Franz was doing. Since the days of the Commission in the 1700s, a random doctor trying to get away from barbaric practices such as leeches and bloodletting, we now have the modern-day practice in psychology called hypnotism. He also worked a lot with helping people understand root causes of who they were, which leads into the psychology part of things, because he believed that the mind was also a huge tool in the healing process. It was kind of an interesting way of looking at life, considering we're just now coming to that point in the last 50 years or so, but in the West, I should say. But he was practicing this as a Western doctor in the 1700s, so that's kind of cool. So, what do you think of this character, Franz Anton Mesmer? Was his practice psychosomatic, the placebo effect? Or was he onto something more along the lines of energy healing and hypnotism of today? Any thoughts, comments, ideas? You can leave them in the comment section below. He also wrote, and I could only find one reference to this book, and it was just titled Mesmerism, and this was his one specifically to the healing arts. There are others who've done biographies of him and, documentation, but the only one I could find that was actually written by him is the one that's linked in the description, and it's not very long. It's a pretty short little read, but it was translated from his French transcript. So, if you're interested, I have the Kindle and the paperback linked down below, but it's not, like I said, it's not a very long book. It's one that been added to my list of things to read for a while now, but who he was and what he did in life was kind of fascinating, because during his time, what he was doing, if it wasn't for the fact that he was a trained medical person, a lawyer, and exceptionally wealthy, he would have probably been imprisoned, if not worse, for what he was doing. But what he was doing was actually helping people, and so, but that time period was not the greatest. So, any thoughts that you have, let me know. Let me know if you enjoy this type of video content that we're doing here, this little series. And if you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. We're trying to build a little channel up here, and if you have any comments, questions, suggestions, even criticisms, you can leave those down below. As long as we're respectful, that's all I ask for. And with that, I will let you guys go and have an awesome evening and enjoy the rest of the week.